So thanks everyone for joining us at this, our first ever Cannabis webinar. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Martin Lane, the co-founder of Cannabis, and hosting today's session is Cannabis Editor-at-Large, Rhys Cohen. Joining Rhys, hello Rhys, how are you?
Good.
Joining Rhys to discuss the implications of the proposed Narcotic Drugs Amendment Medicinal Cannabis Bill are Australian Medicinal Cannabis Association Secretary and lawyer Teresa Nicoletti and CAN Group's Head of Legal and Regulatory Affairs Stephen Notaro. So thanks to all of our panellists for giving up the time. Now, you can get involved in the conversation. Just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to put any questions to the panel, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. We will be recording today's session, so if you do miss anything, you'll be able to watch proceedings back on Cannabis in the coming days. With that, I shall hand over to Rhys to get us started. Rhys, over to you.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks everybody for being here, especially Teresa and Stephen. It's great to have you both in the same virtual room. So what we're talking about today is a bill that was tabled in Parliament recently, which proposes to change legislation around how the commercial activities of cannabis companies are managed in Australia. So basically it's about mostly about changing licenses and permits and how they function. But, you know, even though this is a bill that's just been introduced to Parliament, really it's a culmination of a number of things that have been brewing under the surface for some time. So what we're going to do today is start by giving you a bit of context and background as to why these proposed changes have been necessary, or why the desire to improve the commercial regulations and legislation has been there. And then we're going to talk about the substance of the bill, what it will mean for license holders, people who currently hold licenses, what it'll mean for people who want to pursue licenses. And then probably towards the end, a more sort of wide-ranging discussion about the extent to which we think this will really genuinely help improve the state of the industry in Australia, and by proxy patient access, and what we can look forward to sort of down the track. So thanks for joining us. Stephen, as the head lawyer for one of the oldest medicinal cannabis companies in Australia, I think it would be fair to say, or at least one of the oldest license holding companies. Can you give us a bit of context or background as to how the system has been operating since 2016 or so, and some of the challenges it's been having, and why we've ended up in the situation we are at the moment?
Sure. Thanks, Rhys. So, look, I think it's well known, or publicised at least, that the majority of the issues under the medicinal framework came about because of an underestimation as to the resources required at the Office of Drug Control to undertake their role as a regulator under the Narcotic Drugs Act. They were provided advice as to what the take-up might be of licence holders in Australia, and that was a significant underestimation. And so for that, since the operational provisions came into place, I think both the regulators have been paying a bit of catch up in terms of how they process the applications and regulate those license holders. And there has been, alongside that, a licensing system that didn't really facilitate a very effective way of dealing with that structure. So in essence, we have a 3-license system under the Narcotic Drugs Act, dealing with medicinal cannabis cultivation and production, i.e. Cultivation for therapeutic uses, as well as research cultivation, and then a manufacturing license under the Narcotic Drugs Act that will have to be also supplemented with manufacturing licenses from the TGA as well. So you may hear this word come up a fair bit during the conversation. There was a lot of repetition in terms of the efforts of both applicants, license holders, as well as the regulator, against the fact that they've been under resourced as a group as well. So those two together really led to what the issues that were, to make a segue into this, into some of the issues that were uncovered during the Macmillan report that led to the bill that's currently being presented at the moment, or partly at least.
Right. So for our listeners, what was the Macmillan Review and how did that come about?
So the Macmillan Review was actually required after 2 years from the introduction of the operative parts of the Narcotic Drugs Act dealing with medicinal cannabis framework. There was the need to undertake a review as to, and should have noted this down, but in essence, I think it was the efficiency of the regulatory system, and to put forward recommendations for amendments to the legislation and the framework to improve the regulatory system, and end up being reduced down to 26 recommendations that were tabled, some of which
so
have been.
So there's a government review that was required by law that, basically did a deep dive into how the ODC has been operating, how well it's been operating, and some of the challenges that companies have been experiencing with the current system. And the output of that was a report that was published in, I want to say September 2019. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Someone can check me on that. With a bunch of recommendations about things that needed to be done to improve the way the ODC operates, so that companies could get on with the job, because it has been notoriously challenging, I think it would be fair to say, for companies to operate within the licensed scheme in Australia. And the flow and effect of that is we don't have as many large-scale local producers as we could have or should have to meet local demand. So there were these 26 recommendations that came out of the Macmillan Review, and they seem to feature quite prominently in this recent piece of legislation that's been tabled in Parliament, or actually passed the lower house yesterday, I think it was. In your opinions, Teresa and Stephen, what were the most crucial recommendations from the Macmillan Review in terms of actually improving the way in which the industry is able to operate? And do you think those have been sufficiently addressed so far, in particular with reference to this piece of legislation?
I might hand over to Teresa on this one to get started.
Well, the Macmillan recommendation that I think is probably the most important one is around patient access, and that's essentially recommendation 9. That's a big question mark as to whether this bill actually does anything that will facilitate patient access, because the majority of the bill focuses on the single license scheme, and then also shifting some of the supply chain arrangements. And whilst that is certainly a good thing, a number of our clients complain about the administrative processes within the Office of Drug Control and how long it takes to get licenses, and how there's overlap in the regulation of licenses in such areas as the fit and proper person test. And the changes that are made to the licensing scheme are good, because they will deal with one license and information submitted in respect of one license for either a cultivation, production or manufacture license will be used in relation to any subsequent applications that are submitted. But one of the points that industry has made strongly all along is really around approval times. And so whilst these changes are good, what we need to really see is if those changes will have a measurable impact on approval times. And yeah, so that's the main question mark that I have arising out of it.
So as Steve was saying, at the moment we have 3 different license types. So when you apply for a cultivation license and a manufacturing license, you supply the same information to do with who you are and who your investors are and who your directors are to both the bit of the agency that assesses cultivation licenses and manufacturing licenses. So you're duplicating the amount of information you need to provide, and research, and those 2 groups aren't very good at talking to each other.
Well, they haven't been historically, but presumably this streamlining of the licensing schemes will dispense with that issue. It won't be an issue anymore because it will be dealt with centrally.
Yeah, the issue of duplicating information and communicating between two different departments will be addressed. But then the subsequent challenge of whether or not, once the information has been received, it gets dealt with in a timely fashion is not something that has been directly addressed in this bill. I think would that be accurate to say? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And then one of the other questions around, which I must say I am disappointed because AMCA has very much a patient focus and around all the aspects of the industry that need to go towards facilitating access to patients at an affordable price. And so one of the things I was hoping to see in this bill was some expanded pathways for access for patients. So at the moment, we have special access scheme, authorised prescriber scheme and clinical trials as our access pathways. And the bill has not changed those pathways other than to provide for the production of reference standards for medicinal cannabis, which has nothing to do with patient access. It's about testing quality.
Can I ask about reference standards? Oh, sorry, Steve, please go on.
I was going to say, maybe just as an overview thought, I don't think the bill has really introduced anything, nor did the recommendations recommend any specific new privileges. It is very much a restructuring of the current activities that you are able to undertake in a way that, personally, I think it does make a lot more sense now to undertake it in this way. There was an ODC consultation session after the Macmillan report before the bill came out that put forward what the new structure may look like. Some of those have found its way into the bill, but all the details aren't quite there yet. But it hasn't, you know, we wouldn't, as a company, be able to undertake any new activity. And as Teresa said, even the supply pathways haven't expanded at all. It is really setting up for hopefully a system that is far more streamlined to be able to operate under by both the license holder and the regulator. That's the hope out of this. That what follows is a structure that can be dealt with, and in terms of patient access, all that this does, and it is a very big all it hopefully shortens those review periods. Hopefully gets product out in a more streamlined, more efficient way, so that Australian patients can be treated, but it's not expanding the scope of who can be treated and how. It's just time to market is really,
Yeah, I recall 2 consultation sessions from the ODC, one about changes to the fees and charges, and one about the, sort of forecasting this single license provision. And I remember a lot of time being spent on behalf of the ODC talking about new fees and charges and how the fees would be calculated, and sort of, laboring the point to some extent. And there was a general feeling in both rooms that no one cared. You could double, you could triple, you could times 10, you could times the fees by 10, so long as processing times were shorter. Everyone would be happy.
Exactly. There was one reason to pay attention to that, though, and it was the way that the fees and charges were established in the first place, which was to look at a cost recovery model against what resources would be required to allow a more efficient system. However, what we haven't seen, though, is that being reflected in statutory timelines in when the ODC will respond. So there are new fees and charges that are to be contemplating the actual work and resources required. I would have thought there would be a natural connection to there after being able to be an established timeline in which concepts, as they were speaking about at the time, complex variations, simple variations, could actually be processed once they have operated for 2 years, plus the review period, and have undertaken an external audit now to find out what the resources were. There seems to be no reason why we couldn't be looking, and hopefully with the regulation updates to come, that could be taken up, because that would be, well, it's not only a question of efficiency, it's a question of confidence as well, that if you know that your review period is a certain period of time, you can prepare for it. You can organise yourself that if you want to be supplying to the market at this point in time, you can work backwards and have the confidence that you're working within the timeline. So I think the fees and charges was interesting to listen to, but it didn't quite get to the end of how you make a connection then to a committal for a decision to be made.
But one of the
fees and
major
charges are all very well and good. What are we paying for?
one of the major problems that I raised at those consultations in relation to their proposal to increase fees and charges was that any revenue generated through fees and charges is automatically at the disposal of the Office of Drug Control. It goes into Consolidated Revenue Fund, and Treasury decides how that is allocated. So there isn't any guarantee that all the fees and charges that are gathered from licence applications will actually go towards increasing the resourcing in the Office of Drug Control. And look, I know they're doing their best there, but each time I've heard that there has been additional resourcing placed in the Office of Drug Control, it hasn't actually translated to any significant changes in approval times as far as my clients are telling me. So that's why I say these changes are great. It'll at least alleviate the administrative burden on companies that are submitting data to Office of Drug Control, but that's not really what we want to see. We want to see a shortening of the approval times.
Can I ask, in your opinions, should we not expect answers to those sorts of questions to be in legislation, but actually to come in time through regulation and guidance? Like, are there things that would normally or could normally be included in this bill that haven't been, or are we simply talking about things that are likely to come through within a few months' time when the regulations are published?
So there are statutory evaluation times under the Therapeutic Goods Act for other medicinal products. And so if you submit an application and it's accepted for evaluation, the TGA is bound by a statutory time. I mean, that's the model that I have been suggesting should be in place for medicinal cannabis as well. That's really the only way to resolve this issue and ensure that these applications are processed in reasonable timeframes.
Are there any reasons we can think of that hasn't been taken up? I mean, obviously, it sort of puts the government on the hook to some extent to commit itself to producing outcomes within specified time periods. But why the hesitation? Do you think, if you had to put your government hat on?
I don't
Might
know.
have a shot at this first. Yeah, I don't know. There's enough clarity around some of the concepts that were being presented to us as to we have bills and charges that describe different categories of activity that will be required of the regulator, but I don't know there's enough clarity as to exactly what falls into which category, and maybe even enough of an understanding as to, okay, it's nice to categorise them, but has those categorisations been, are we correct in describing what we think might be a simple process in terms of time allocation or not? So I think maybe it might be a time might tell if they made the split correctly, and maybe at that point in time they might be in a better position to commit to timelines. That's me putting my government hat on for a second there to try to see the other side of the coin, but
I don't think we can speculate that there won't be an improvement yet. I'm certainly not suggesting that these changes are not good changes, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We'll have to wait and see whether it has any impact on approval times.
I wanted to touch on patient access and improving patient access, which is ostensibly one of the objectives of this bill and one of the recommendations from the Macmillan review. You mentioned, both of you, that the access pathways have remained unchanged. They remain, category B, authorised prescriber, clinical trials. What other access pathways would you have liked to have seen legislated in this bill that are absent?
Well, you could have a notification scheme that doesn't require any prior approval by the TGA and puts the onus on a medical practitioner to make a decision whether to prescribe, and then periodically that medical practitioner would be required to submit information to the TGA about who the product has been prescribed to. So that would remove a lot of red tape. Look, you know, to be honest, I've had some recent personal experience with the use of cannabis for my family. And I actually am quite happy with the ability to get access and how quickly you can get access. I do have a question mark about the competence of some people to actually prescribe, and that's personal experience as well, or the types of products they are prescribing. But the issue is around affordability, and I've seen that firsthand as well. So the whole story about patient access, we seem to have resolved the ability of patients to get access to cannabis, i.e. get a doctor to prescribe it. But the issue is around whether they can then afford to have that prescription dispensed. And just in the family examples that I've had over the past couple of weeks, it's extraordinarily prohibitive, the cost.
Yeah, it seems that if a doctor wants to prescribe medicinal cannabis, it's relatively quick and easy for that to occur. The challenge is patients finding a doctor who's educated enough to consider prescribing, and then of course affording the medicine. I had a chat with someone earlier today who was describing to me their experience going through accessing medicinal cannabis on prescription, and they deliberately chose the cheapest medicinal cannabis clinic they could find, because that's what most Australians would do. If you're living with a chronic illness, you're trying to get access to cannabis medicine, of course you're gonna go for the cheapest option. And the experience they had was really poor. And I sort of flippantly said, oh well, that's you get what you pay for to some extent. But we're talking about medical care here, complex care patients. It's not nothing to be trifled with, so to speak. I mean, Stephen, your company's involved in producing cannabis locally in Australia that is ending up in the hands of patients. What's your feeling at the moment about the costs of these medicines? Is it largely due to regulatory adherence, or cost of production, or what do you think might happen with price over time? Sorry to put you on the spot there.
No. We are a victim to the framework that we're working under, and it's not just the Narcotic Drugs Act. It is the very high standards of GMP manufacturing in Australia as well. So I know that there's separate reviews and submissions being undertaken to deal with what the appropriate balance of patient access, including imported products, is against a requirement of an even playing field in terms of GMP manufacturing standards across the board, and that is a balance. We can't sell short, cut short supply just because we want to insist immediately on, in my opinion, on an immediate transition there. But there is a cost associated with it, and the regulatory red tape, and there is quite a bit of it to get from plant right through to patient hands. There is a lot to deal with, particularly if you're not conducting that entire process yourself. If you're dealing with other license holders, currently, because of the 3 license system and because of the current processing time, the approvals are in essence doubled. They're sometimes in parallel, but for a cultivator to provide to a manufacturer, both parties have to be reviewed in terms of the supply pathway between both entities before the product can be handed, or the cannabis can be handed over for manufacturing for then on supply. One of the key features that during the discussions, during the consultation period that was being put forward was the concept of categories as opposed to discrete supply pathways. I haven't seen that in the bill, but I know that they have talked of permitted supplies now, including those allowed under the regulations, is always the last catch.
to clarify, so
Yeah.
to clarify. So at the moment, if you're a cultivator and you're supplying to a manufacturer, you must specify which manufacturer you're supplying to, what quantity, when, for what purpose,
Have a contract
and
in
then
place.
both parties need to be checked by the ODC. But there's been discussion about allowing a cultivator to supply to licensed manufacturers more broadly. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Correct. Yes. So that would be a that would be a streamlining, but we haven't seen that flow right through to the regulations yet, and I think that's when it will take effect. And look, I know that we might be hitting on later in the discussion the transitional provisions as well, but they seem to blanketly suggest that your current licenses will flow through if you already hold one, as will your permits. I'm interested in the detail there as to whether you also take up the benefits of these new simplified categories of pathways at the same time, or if you're stuck with that. But look, it's a good stepping stone, but I want to see how it's implemented now through both the regulatory change of the regulations as well, and more importantly, how it will be dealt with in terms of the if we require an application process at all for that once it's an approved pathway, or do we start to move more and more towards notification? And my thought here is that we've now been operating as an industry with, in comparison to other countries, with no standout significant breaches of licensing conditions that have, significant ones that, as an industry, I think most license holders are operating very well, highly compliant, and with that learning, the balance of compliance should fall more onto the license holder, and as opposed to upfront having to go through a very onerous process of checking the credentials of not only each party but each element of what you're looking to undertake. I think that putting the onus back on the license holder and not dealing with those who have licenses know of 14J requests, requests for further information against any type of application you put in or variation. A lot of those matters are really seeking to understand in advance how you might undertake an activity, what your operational methods are, things that are almost educational in nature for a regulator, as opposed to a firm condition that matches up against the legislation.
And I'm sure many companies would be on board with happy to provide education on how business operations happen to the regulator, so long as that's not a prerequisite for getting your paperwork through.
Correct.
And spends time holding things up. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Speaking of transitions and provisional licenses, because there'll be people watching this here now and in the future watching this, thinking about, I currently hold a license, or I have a license that's been in the queue for a while, or I'm about to submit a new license. What should I do? How do I make sure that I do things most efficiently? Teresa, what do you reckon about that? What's the take-home message here?
So it's a pretty straightforward, and this is probably my favourite part of the bill in terms of drafting it. It's quite a common sense approach. So if you currently hold one licence under the Narcotic Drugs Act, it will become a preserved licence under the new scheme. If you hold 2 or more licences under the Narcotic Drugs Act now, they will become converted licences. So they will be converted into one licence that specifies the conditions that you hold. So for example, if you have a medicinal cannabis licence and a cannabis research licence, you'll have that'll be converted to one licence that will specify you are allowed to do research and you are allowed to cultivate. If you have an application that has been submitted before the legislation comes on foot, then that will become a deemed application under the new scheme. So you have been deemed to make an application under the single licence scheme, and it will continue to be evaluated on that basis. If you have an application in at the time of the transfer, or the time the new legislation comes into effect, so if you have an application in and you hold one licence, the license you hold will become a preserved license, and the license application you have submitted will become a variation under the new scheme. It will be deemed to be an application for a variation to your existing license. Okay, I think I've covered all the scenarios.
So to clarify, if you already hold a license that's in effect, that license will become a preserved license, which essentially means you don't need to do anything or take any extra steps. It'll just transition over into the new scheme and it'll be called a preserved license. If you have an application that's in the queue at the moment, where you've submitted a license application under the old scheme, the new scheme comes into effect, and then your license gets approved, then that's called a deemed license. But in effect,
it's a deemed application. It's not a deemed license. Yep. The license will become a license under the new scheme. So it won't be preserved, okay. It won't be converted, it will be just a new license under the new scheme.
Got you. The long and the short of it, from my naive impression, is it sounds like everything will probably work out fine. Like it sounds like it'll be a relatively smooth transition, at least with regards to the legislation, right? So
there's no transition periods because there doesn't need to be a transition period.
Got you.
All licenses and all applications are transitioned immediately by those terms: preserved license, converted license, deemed application, or variation.
Right. Got you. And then in terms of how permits, if there are any active permits corresponding to those licenses, we get to understand what'll happen to that, or they'll also just transition across.
Well, they're also deemed. They're also deemed, if they're existing applications, they're also deemed. If they're existing permits, they're preserved.
And Therese, I'm not as familiar with that Schedule 2 structure, but was it described, or would it be reasonable to assume that if a current license holder had multiple licenses for multiple sites, that they would be combined under the new license system into a single, that was the intention at the time, I think, to have a single license with schedules to deal with each of the sites that was going to be held by a single license holder. So I don't think it went into that detail as to what that transition would occur for multiple sites, but I take it that also be converted across and then collected under a single license with the schedules for each of the sites at the same time.
Yeah. One license holder can hold several licenses at different sites. Beautiful. Yeah, correct.
We've got a question, and by the way, if you have a question that you'd like to ask any of our panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A function on the Zoom chat. We have a question that's come through from Michael Real, apologies for butchering your name, who is essentially asking, it sounds like this is going to streamline the license sort of process, which will, and the intent of that is to reduce regulatory burden, presumably. And they ask, do you believe the cost of medicine will reduce for patients when that becomes a single license?
I think this will be one element that would start to reduce the costs of operation in general. Each area where there isn't, over regulation and unnecessarily burdensome regulation that can be reduced is only going to slowly cut down the costs. So I think it'll go, it will be one of the measures, one of the stepping stones towards being able to operate more efficiently and then being able to pass on those cost savings to patients. Sorry.
The proof will be in the pudding. Once again,
So look, it certainly will save a lot of time from the regulatory departments of both entities to be able to understand that once you're licensed, you can transact with each other and not have to spend days, weeks, and waiting months to get the outcome you're after. So that alone helps.
We have a question from Josh Dennis, which is a fairly open-ended question, asking our panelists to touch on each of these recommendations. I presume, Josh, you're talking about the 26 recommendations from the Macmillan Review. That'd be quite a laundry list. Are there, Steve, you mentioned that you put a little cheat sheet together. Are there any sort of standout recommendations that are pertinent to you and your work that you'd like to highlight?
Look, I think the major one here, there's a few clarification. One is with the, quite simply, the alignment of certain terms to the single convention. Cannabis plant now picks up that definition. I believe there was a recommendation to provide further definitions, including manufacture and research, which I didn't see in the bill. I think they missed that one. That would have been quite handy, because there is always a grey area between what is manufacture for the purpose of the Narcotic Drugs Act and what might be, for example, sample preparation and so on and so forth. But potentially there's no need to consider that anymore, because you might be under a single license, so it doesn't matter. So long as your ancillary activity is covered, you might be fine. But I was the real big one is the recommendation 7, which is the actual single license itself. And then another interesting one was there was a recommendation 10, being that that licenses should have a maximum term of 5 years. Now that was discussed at length at the consultation seminars as well. There is obvious benefit to industry there, because it's not a renewal process, it's a reapplication process once your license comes up for the end of its term. So having a 5-year term was great, but it's actually been changed to
perpetual.
Sorry, just one
perpetual,
on
correct.
that point. It's actually a perpetual license.
Yeah, it's getting into that one. Yep. So the regulator may impose a time period on your license, and if they don't, it's perpetual.
Oh, okay. So they reserve the right to impose it.
They reserve the right. If there is a period, there are provisions to deal with it. Otherwise, it's silence as to. Therefore, it's perpetual if they haven't imposed that.
Conditions.
Curious to know that. Yep.
Yeah. Great. Fantastic. Great. Well, I don't know if we have any other questions that have come through from the audience. And we're just over sort of approaching
there is
40
one.
minutes now.
There is one question.
Oh, yes.
What does the change in the definition of narcotic in the Act mean for producers? I can answer that.
Oh, please do. I missed that completely.
Means absolutely nothing. So the only reason the definitions were changed and the definition was introduced for cannabis drug was in recognition that the medicinal cannabis scheme was uniquely created to deal with medicinal cannabis and no other drugs. And it was decided that for that reason, it would be beneficial to, if you like, carve out cannabis drug from other narcotic drugs. It doesn't mean that it carves it out and cannabis drug is not, the term cannabis drug is not intended to include narcotic drugs, but it was a practical measure to separate out the medicinal cannabis scheme, which is now in Chapter 2, and the remainder of the Narcotic Drugs Act regulations are in Chapter 3. So that was the purpose of that.
Yeah, that was something that jumped out to a few people, I think, and got our hopes up to some extent. But yeah, it seems like it's a non-starter.
You can be more hopeful though, Reece. It does mean you only have to deal with the review of one chapter when you're looking to see what your rights and responsibilities are now as well. So there's some benefits there.
There's always a silver lining. That's what I like about you, Stephen.
No.
Thank you. All right. Well, look, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I do want to say thank you again to both of you for contributing your time to this chat. And I'll bring Martin back in to wrap us up.
Thank you very much, Reece. I think that's the longest I've managed to stay quiet in my life. Just
one, buttons for.
Just one last question for the guys, actually, from me. You mentioned that it remains to be seen whether this is going to help with approval times and whether it's going to do much about patient access. Just wearing your kind of industry lobbying hats for a second, assuming this bill gets passed, which we think it will. What are the next steps from your point of view in terms of having conversations to try and make changes that aren't in the bill and make those improvements that you talked about around approval times and patient access?
look, I might start with a ray of shining light on this. I think what they put forward is a very good restructuring of the framework, and I think it does now present the opportunity for us to do exactly what you described there, work with the regulator and see how this can be put into operation and have those quicker timelines achieved. One of the key areas to resolve, I think, is the triaging and the triaging of matters put in front of the ODC, so they can be prioritised in accordance with whatever the most reasonable standards may be, taking patient access as being the ultimate one there. But there's a consistent approach to how applications can be made and reviewed, but there can be something on the lines of a standard form that can be used for dealing with, on the one hand, we have the simplicity of dealing with a single license, which is fantastic. On the other hand, what's the detail around what the permits are going to look like to be able to contemplate a license structure that has 2 additional layers of complexity. So if it was a medicinal license before, you might be talking about a permit that is trying to deal with manufacturing at the same time, or they may choose to keep them quite separate and deal with them that way. But if we're going to have an efficient system moving forward, my mind is the discussion now needs to be about the permitting system and permitting structure, because the structure of the license works well enough as a springboard. The day-to-day operations in our industry, I mean, in our company at least, is mostly focused on discussions around the permit, not of the license.
Okay, and Teresa, did you have anything on that from a kind of AMCAR point of view?
Yeah, look, Martin, I don't know that there's too much more to be added to the narcotic drugs legislation, other than expanding the access pathways, as I suggested, with a notification type scheme. And to Steve's point, a lot of what has to be done now is more on the administrative side, from management of ODC resourcing and the timelines. Where I see industry should head next is to look at some of the clinic models and look at what other factors are contributing to high prices. Because I suspect with domestic supply getting up and running, and it will be increasingly competitive with more companies coming online, we need to start having a look at why are products still so expensive. If there's a supply and demand adjustment to price from actual manufacturers, what else is causing these high prices? So that's, I think AMCA's pretty keen to have a look at that next.
Okay, well, we will leave it there. Thank you again to Rhys and Teresa and Steve for taking the time to talk to us tonight, and thanks to everyone for joining us. If you missed anything or you want to watch the discussion again, it will be up on the Cannabis website tomorrow. And also do please sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already done so. So thanks again for joining us, and have a good evening, everyone. Cheers.